the war that almost erased Ethiopia. In the spring of 1529, on a plain called Shimbrakure, two armies faced each other beneath the Ethiopian highlands. One was Christian, the army of an empire that had ruled these mountains by its own telling since the days of the Queen of Sheba, an empire that had survived in some form for over 1,000 years. Medieval Europe knew it by rumor and legend, the fabled kingdom of Prester John, a Christian king hidden somewhere beyond the Islamic world, waiting to be found. The other army was Muslim, soldiers of a small sultanate on the hot, dry coast below the mountains, a state most outsiders had never heard of. Its name was Adal. Its commander was a man in his early 20s, a former provincial administrator turned holy warrior who signed his name Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi. The Ethiopians would give him a different name, one that would outlive almost everything else about him: Gragn, the left-handed. What happened over the next 14 years is one of the most consequential wars in African history, and one of the least known outside it. A small coastal sultanate using Ottoman muskets and cannon, smuggled up the Red Sea, came within a hair's breadth of destroying one of the oldest Christian kingdoms on earth. 3/4 of Ethiopia fell. Its emperor died a fugitive in his own mountains. Its churches burned by the hundred. And Europe, watching an Islamic army roll over a legendary Christian empire, sent the first Portuguese soldiers to set foot on the African mainland in a war that would help decide who controlled the Horn of Africa for the next 300 years. This is the story of the Ethiopian Adal War. Ethiopians call it a near apocalypse. Somalis and Hararis remember its commander as a national hero. Both are telling the truth. This is that war, from both sides of the mountain. Chapter 1: Two Worlds on One Mountain. To understand why this war happened, you first have to understand the geography that made it almost inevitable. The Ethiopian highlands are a fortress built by nature. Steep escarpments, deep river gorges, plateaus that sit over 2,000 meters above sea level. For centuries, this terrain protected the Christian kingdoms of the interior from the armies of the coast. Ethiopia's rulers, the Solomonic dynasty, claimed descent from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba through their son Menelik. Whether or not you take that genealogy literally, the dynasty's Christianity was very real and very old. Ethiopia had adopted Christianity in the 4th century, centuries before most of northern Europe, making it one of the oldest continuously Christian states on earth. Below those highlands, along the hot coastal strip toward the Gulf of Aden, a different world had taken shape. Islam had arrived in the Horn of Africa within decades of the Prophet Muhammad's death, carried by Arab traders across the narrow strip of water separating the Arabian Peninsula from the African coast. By the 9th or 10th century, Muslim trading sultanates were flourishing at ports like Zayla, controlling the caravan routes that carried gold, ivory, slaves, and above all, salt, up into the highlands in exchange for grain and textiles. One of these Muslim polities eventually became known as the Sultanate of Adal, ruled first from the coast and later, as it came under pressure, from the inland city of Harar. For the highland Christian kings, these Muslim sultanates of the lowlands occupied a strange and shifting role, sometimes tributaries, sometimes trading partners, sometimes the target of punitive raids, meant to remind them who held the mountains. For the Muslim sultanates, the Christian empire above them controlled the fertile highland breadbasket and, crucially, some of the most direct routes to the interior gold and ivory trade. Access to that trade and freedom from Ethiopian tribute demands was worth fighting for. This had already produced 2 centuries of intermittent war before Ahmad ibn Ibrahim was even born. Ethiopian emperors periodically marched down from the highlands to sack Muslim towns and force new sultans to pay tribute. Adal's rulers periodically raided upward into Christian territory. Neither side had ever managed to permanently break the other. It was a stalemate written into the landscape itself. Ethiopia too strong in its mountain fortress to be conquered from below, Adal too far from the highlands' agricultural core to be permanently held down from above. There was a third element sharpening the conflict, one that had nothing to do with trade routes. Religion had become identity. Ethiopian emperors saw themselves, and were seen, as far away as Portugal, as the last major Christian bulwark standing between Islam and the depths of Africa. Adal's rulers, and increasingly its subjects, understood their raids against Ethiopia not just as border warfare, but as jihad, a religious struggle against a Christian power that periodically burned mosques and forced conversions during its own campaigns. By the early 16th century, both sides had a script for this war already written in religious terms, long before Ahmad ibn Ibrahim picked up a sword. What changed everything was not a new grievance. It was a new weapon and a new man to wield it. Chapter 2: The Left-Handed Imam. Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi was born around 1506 in Hubat, a district south of Adal's political heartland, into a world of near-constant low-grade war. As a young man, he served under Mahfuz, the aggressive governor of Zela, who had spent years leading annual raids into Ethiopian territory, raids that, more than once, ended in disaster. In 1517, Mahfuz himself was killed in one of these campaigns by the Ethiopian regent in a battle so celebrated on the Christian side that it briefly convinced the Ethiopian court that the Adal threat was finished. It was not finished, it was regrouping. Ahmad married Bati del Wambara, the daughter of the fallen Mahfuz, a marriage that tied him directly into Adal's military aristocracy and its unfinished war of revenge. Adal itself was in crisis through the 1520s, racked by a succession struggle between rival claimants to the Sultanate. Ahmad backed one faction, helped defeat the reigning Sultan Abu Bakr ibn Muhammad, and by around 1527 had maneuvered himself into effective control of the state, ruling not as Sultan himself, but as Imam, a religious military title that let him claim leadership of a holy war rather than a mere dynastic seizure of power. What made Ahmad different from every raiding warlord who came before him was what he did next. He modernized his army using a resource almost no previous Adal leader had access to at scale: Ottoman firearms. The Ottoman Empire, expanding its influence down the Red Sea in the early 16th century, had both the muskets and the interest in seeing a fellow Muslim power check Christian Ethiopia. Through Zayla and other Red Sea ports, matchlock guns and, most decisively, cannon began flowing into Adal's arsenal, along with Ottoman and Arab mercenary gunners who knew how to use them. Ethiopia, isolated behind its highlands and only loosely in contact with Christian Europe, had virtually no firearms of its own. Its armies still fought largely as they had for centuries, with spears, swords, and cavalry. This was the imbalance that turned a border conflict into an existential war. Ahmad had something no earlier Adal commander possessed, a technological edge sharp enough to overturn Ethiopia's numerical advantage, and in 1529 he decided to use it, declaring the coming war a jihad, framing it explicitly as retaliation for a Christian raid the previous year, and marching his army up into the highlands. Chapter 3, Shimbra Kura, 1529. A historiographical note before the battles begin. Almost everything we know about the military details of this war, troop numbers, casualty counts, the drama of individual battles, comes from two sources with every reason to exaggerate. On the Adal side, the chronicle Futuh al-Habasha, written by Ahmad's companion Sihab ad-Din, was composed explicitly to celebrate the conquest as a triumph of Islam. On the Ethiopian side, royal chronicles and saints' lives were composed to mourn a Christian catastrophe, and later to celebrate its reversal as an act of God. Treat every number in this script as an order of magnitude, not a census. What both traditions agree on, the sequence of battles, the outcome, the devastation, is far more reliable than what either tradition claims about how many men died getting there. In March 1529, Emperor Lebna Dengel led a large Ethiopian force to meet Ahmad's army at Shimbra Kure, south of the Highland Corps. By every account, the Ethiopians substantially outnumbered the Adal force. On paper, this should have been the same story as every earlier border war, a large Highland army grinding down a smaller lowland raiding force. It was not. Ahmad's soldiers, by the Arabic Chronicle's own admission, were frightened as the much larger Ethiopian army approached. Some reportedly tried to desert on the eve of battle. Ahmad held his force together, and when the two armies met, his cannon and matchlock men did something Ethiopian soldiers had never faced in open battle before. They killed at a distance before spears or cavalry could close. The psychological shock of gunfire, more than its raw killing power, appears to have been decisive. The Ethiopian line broke. Ahmad won a costly but complete victory. Shimbra Kure did not conquer Ethiopia, but it proved something that would define the next 14 years. Firearms had permanently changed the calculus of this ancient rivalry. Ahmad's army now had morale, momentum, and proof of concept. Lebna Dengel's army had just learned at devastating cost that its centuries-old way of fighting was no longer enough. Chapter 4. The Conquest of Abyssinia. For 2 years after Shimbra Kure, Ahmad consolidated and rearmed. Then in 1531, he returned, and this time his campaign did not stop. At the Battle of Antioquia, a Dal cannon fire panicked the Ethiopian defenders before the lines even fully engaged, delivering another lopsided victory. Months later, on October 28, 1531, Ahmad crushed Lebna Dengel's forces again at the Battle of Ambosel, effectively breaking the emperor's capacity to field an army that could stand against him in open battle. From there, Ahmad's forces marched essentially unopposed, sweeping through the Ethiopian highlands to loot and burn a string of the empire's most sacred sites. This is the part of the war Ethiopian memory has never let go of. Between 1529 and 1535, Ahmad's armies overran what chroniclers describe as three-quarters of Christian Ethiopia, from Shoa in the south to Tigray in the north. Churches and monasteries that had stood for centuries, repositories of manuscripts, crosses, and relics that were central to Ethiopian Christian identity, were burned. Communities that refused conversion to Islam were, by both traditions' accounts, killed in large numbers. Ethiopian nobles and common subjects alike converted to Islam by the thousands, some out of genuine persuasion, many simply to survive an occupying army that offered conversion as the alternative to death or flight. Lebna Dengel, the emperor who a decade earlier had ruled over a stable and confident kingdom, was reduced to a fugitive in his own country, moving from mountain refuge to mountain refuge, unable to muster an army capable of meeting Ahmad in the field, watching his empire dissolve province by province. He would die in September 1540, still on the run, having never recovered so much as a fraction of what he had lost. By the mid-1530s, the state of affairs would have seemed unthinkable to either side just a decade earlier. A Muslim sultanate whose entire population was smaller than a single Ethiopian province now effectively ruled most of the ancient Christian Highland Empire. The kingdom that medieval Europe imagined as the impregnable realm of Prester John was, in reality, on the verge of ceasing to exist as an independent Christian state. It survived for one reason above all others. The mountains that had shaped this entire conflict from the beginning gave it just enough broken terrain and just enough time to keep fighting rather than surrendering outright. And it survived because, in its desperation, Ethiopia reached out to a power that had never before set foot on the African mainland in war: Portugal. Chapter 5: A Kingdom on the Brink. Portugal's interest in Ethiopia predated this war by decades. Portuguese explorers rounding Africa in search of a sea route to India had long heard rumors of a Christian kingdom somewhere in the African interior, the legendary realm of Prester John. And by the early 16th century, actual Portuguese embassies had reached the Ethiopian court. When Ahmad's conquest began devastating the highlands, Ethiopia's rulers turned to this existing relationship as their last realistic hope of outside help. Portuguese soldiers were already stationed at strategic points along the Indian Ocean and Red Sea coastline, in a global contest with the Ottoman Empire for control of these trade routes, which meant a request for Portuguese military aid against an Ottoman armed Muslim sultanate fit neatly into Portugal's own strategic interests. Before that help could arrive, Ethiopia had to survive its own succession crisis. When Lebna Dengel died in September 1540, his son Gelawdewos inherited a throne that barely existed, a title without a functioning kingdom, most of its territory under occupation, its treasury and armies scattered. Gelawdewos was young, but in the months after his accession, he began doing something Ethiopia badly needed: winning. He led a string of successful strikes against isolated Adal garrisons in the north, lifting the morale of a Christian population that had spent a decade being told, in the starkest possible terms, that God had abandoned them. It was not enough on its own. In April 1541, Gelawdewos's forces were defeated at the Battle of Sahart by one of Ahmad's lieutenants, a reminder that the core problem from Shimbra onward had never gone away. Ethiopia still could not reliably beat Adal's gunners in open battle. What Ethiopia needed was not just a determined young emperor. It needed guns of its own. They were already on their way. Chapter 6. The Portuguese Land. In February 1541, a Portuguese expedition landed on the Red Sea coast at Massawa, commanded by Cristóvão da Gama, son of the famed navigator Vasco da Gama, and a soldier in his own right. His force was small by the standards of this war, roughly 400 musketeers, equipped with modern firearms and artillery of a kind Ethiopia's own armies had never possessed. It was, by any measure, a modest expeditionary force to send against an empire-shattering army, but 400 trained gunners were enough to change the mathematics of the war, because for the first time since Shimbra, the firepower gap that had decided every major battle was no longer entirely one-sided. Da Gama pushed inland to link up with the remnants of Ethiopian resistance, and, notably, with Sabla Wangel, Lebna Dengel's widow, and Gelawdewos's mother, who had spent the occupation years as a rallying point for Christian loyalists still refusing to submit. The combined Portuguese-Ethiopian force won a string of early engagements against Ahmad's forces through 1541 and into 1542, a reversal so alarming to Ahmad that he did what any commander facing a sudden shift in enemy firepower would do. He appealed to his own patron for reinforcement. The Ottoman Empire, which had armed Adal from the beginning, sent additional troops and, crucially, its own artillery and matchlock men to restore the balance. The reinforced Ottoman Adal force met da Gama's army at the Battle of Wofla in August 1542. This time, the guns favored the other side. Da Gama's force was crushed. Cristóvão da Gama himself was captured. According to the accounts that survive, Ahmad had him tortured and executed shortly afterward, a brutal end that, in Ethiopian and Portuguese memory alike, would only sharpen the resolve of the survivors who regrouped around Gelawdewos. It would have been entirely reasonable, at this point in the story, to expect Adal's final and total victory. Ahmad had just destroyed the one force capable of matching his firepower. Instead, Wofla turned out to be the last major victory Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi would ever win. Chapter 7. Waina Daga. The surviving Portuguese musketeers, along with Gelawdewos's regrouped Ethiopian forces, retreated and reorganized rather than surrendering, after Wafla. On February 21st, 1543, or some sources give February 10th, the two exhausted armies met one final time near Lake Tana in the Dembia region, at a place called Waina Daga. What decided this battle, according to the traditions that survive, was not a grand tactical reversal, but a single moment of chance amid the chaos of combat. A Portuguese musketeer, in the thick of the fighting, shot and killed Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi. He was 36 or 37 years old and had spent 14 years reshaping the political map of the Horn of Africa. He died in roughly the same kind of engagement that had made his career possible in the first place, killed, fittingly and bitterly, by the very gunpowder technology he had used to conquer 3/4 of Ethiopia. The effect was immediate and total. Without Ahmad, the coalition of Somali, Harari, and allied forces that had held together an occupation of most of Ethiopia for over a decade simply came apart. His widow, Bati del Wambara, and the surviving remnants of his army retreated toward Harar. The Christian Portuguese force pursued, and in the war's final act of consolidation, ambushed and destroyed a second retreating column shortly afterward, ensuring there would be no immediate regrouping. 14 years of war, a war that had come dangerously close to erasing Christian Ethiopia from the map entirely, ended in a single afternoon, decided by a single bullet. Chapter 8. What the War Left Behind. Ahmad's death did not simply end the war. It unraveled everything the war had built. Ethiopian and apostate communities across the formerly occupied territories reverted to Christianity in large numbers almost immediately, a reminder that much of the conversion imposed during the occupation had been a survival strategy rather than a settled change of belief. Galawdwas spent the following years methodically reclaiming Ethiopian territory, eventually pushing Adal's remaining forces back as far as Harar itself by 1559, where he was finally checked by Ahmad's nephew and eventual successor, Nur ibn Mujahid, who, in a grim symmetry, killed Galawdwas in that same 1559 campaign in a war of revenge for his uncle's death. But neither side truly won this war in any lasting sense. 14 years of devastation had gutted both states. Ethiopia's economy, church infrastructure, and manuscript heritage had suffered catastrophic losses that some regions never fully recovered from. Adal, having burned through its resources and its most capable leadership in Ahmad's campaigns, began fragmenting almost immediately after his death and would never again mount an existential threat to the Ethiopian highlands. Within a generation, both exhausted powers found themselves facing a force neither had anticipated. Large-scale Oromo migrations into the very territories the war had just devastated and depopulated, reshaping the demographic map of the Ethiopian highlands for centuries to come. Arguably, the single largest long-term consequence of the war, and one neither Ahmad nor Lebna Dengel nor Galawdwas ever saw coming. And then there is memory, which, in this story, never converged the way the territory eventually did. In Ethiopian tradition, Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi is Gragn, the left-handed destroyer who burned the churches and nearly ended a Christian civilization 1,000 years in the making. In Somali and Harari tradition, he is Ahmed Gure, a national hero, the general who united fractious clans and sultanates into a single force capable of humbling the region's dominant empire, whose memory is still honored in the Horn of Africa today. Both traditions are describing the same man. Neither is wrong. That is, in the end, what a 14-year war leaves behind. Not a settled verdict, but two peoples who watched the same fire and remember it differently. Closing. The Ethiopian Adal War rarely makes it into the general narrative of world history taught outside the Horn of Africa. But look at what it actually was. A small state's rise on the back of new military technology. A legendary Christian kingdom brought to the edge of collapse, the first European soldiers to fight a war on African soil in the modern era, and a demographic aftershock, the Oromo migrations, that reshaped an entire region for centuries. It is a war that decided, in a very real sense, what the Horn of Africa would look like for the next 300 years. It is also simply a human story of a young imam who built an army out of a defeated people and very nearly changed the map of a continent, and of a young emperor who inherited nothing but a title and, against every reasonable expectation, held on long enough to win it back.